Ronald Reagan do solemnly swear.
From ABC in New York, this is World News Tonight, Sunday, with Sam Donaldson.
Good evening. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States, where he's receiving medical treatment for cancer. Some reports say as many as 90 Americans may be involved. Others say as few as 35. A look at what has happened in Tehran, as narrated by Richard Anderson.
The Iranians had fought U.S. Marine guards for 3 hours for control of the embassy. The Marines used tear gas, but were eventually overrun at 5 o'clock this morning, New York time, as Revolutionary Guards and local police stood by and watched. While the Iranians burned an American flag in front of the embassy, they said the takeover had the express blessing of the Ayatollah Khomeini. In return for their American hostages' freedom, they're demanding the United States give up the deposed Shah of Iran from his hospital bed in New York to stand trial before a people's court. Until that is done, the demonstrators refuse to make any promises about the fate of the American hostages. Immediately after the takeover, the crowd put up pictures of the Ayatollah and a scene inside the compound gate. Outside, newsmen and women waited for any information. But one fact is clear tonight, that the American lives. Richard Anderson, ABC News.
The action against the embassy may or may not have been ordered by Iran's religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. That is not clear, but it does appear to have his blessing. A spokesman in the holy city of Qom said the move has the Ayatollah's personal support, which adds to Washington's difficulty in trying to resolve this dangerous situation. Ted Koppel, our diplomatic correspondent, is standing by at the State Department with the latest on that. Ted?
The State Department is doing what it can, but for the moment at least, that doesn't appear to be much. There has been no direct contact with the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. That building is under the total control of the demonstrators. During the takeover, by coincidence, the senior American diplomat in Iran, Bruce Langan, the charge d'affaires, was at the foreign ministry. He has remained there throughout the day, acting as Washington's main link to the Iranian government. The State Department has set up a special task force in a small room next to the operations center. The force is headed by Assistant Secretary of State Harold Saunders. But Secretary of State Vance himself came in this morning, stayed until early afternoon, and twice briefed President Carter, who's up at Camp David, by phone. So far, official comments about the incident have been a model of restraint, an expression of concern for the safety of American personnel and property, and a statement of appreciation that the Iranian government has made some efforts to resolve the matter. Sam?
Ted, the Ayatollah's support for this action is ominous, is it not?
Well, it may or may not be ominous. The State Department is making a particular point to distinguish the Ayatollah Khomeini from the Iranian government. That's why it's being so restrained in its direct references to the government.
Thank you very much, Ted. Here in New York, where the Shah is undergoing chemotherapy treatment for cancer, Iranian students chained themselves to the Statue of Liberty and unfurled banners demanding that the Shah be returned to Iran for punishment. The demonstrators were cut loose by police and taken into custody.
Iranian students are still holding 59 Americans hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. In fact, the situation in Iran got even worse today when students seized 2 American consulates in the cities of Tabriz and Shiraz. Iranian students also occupied the British Embassy in Tehran, but left after 5 hours. The various takeovers have been given the full support of Iran's religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who claims that the American embassy has been the center of plots by what he calls the Great Satan America. It's been very difficult to get pictures out of Iran. We have the only pictures from there today in this exclusive report from Bob Dyke.
About 500 Iranian youths continue to occupy the embassy compound here in Tehran, while close to 2,000 supporters outside the gates rallied in support of the takeover. There was no sign of any of the hostages. We understand they are being kept inside one of these buildings, but we were not told which building. We were told the captive Americans are being treated well, that their needs are being looked after. We were also told that they are being interrogated and that some of them will be brought before newsmen when their interrogation is finished. That may be tomorrow or later this week. At a news conference inside the compound, we were shown photographs taken yesterday of U.S. Marine guards at the embassy after they were taken prisoner and blindfolded by their captors. Members of the Student Occupation Committee also displayed some weapons they say they seized during the takeover. And a punctured poster of Khomeini, the committee charged, was used as a dartboard by a senior U.S. official. Khomeini's son attended the news conference to confirm his father's endorsement of the takeover, and we understand to exert a moderating influence among those inside the compound. Outside the compound, as night fell, a burning symbol of the demonstrators' smoldering anti-American passion. Give us the Shah, they cried, and we will free the Americans. To the demonstrators, the solution is simple, and they don't see why others don't see the issue as clearly as they do. That is why they say they've taken to the streets and taken possession of the embassy and its people. Bob Dyke, ABC News, Tehran.
This is Barry Dunsmore. The U.S. does not have a great number of options in dealing with what is a very sensitive situation in which there is no central authority. But one thing is certain. There will be no bowing to the mob's demand for the return of the Shah.
In answer to the question, are we considering handing him over, or are there any plans to do so or to meet that demand, the answer is no.
A round-the-clock interagency task force has been at work here at the State Department since the seizure of the embassy. Among other things, it has been in indirect contact with the Shah to assure him of the U.S. decision to stand firm. Meantime, the policy decided upon is to speak carefully and lean on the Iranian government as opposed to the Ayatollah Khomeini.
We do expect the Iranian government to secure the safe release of the Americans held and the return of the embassy compound to American authorities.
However, as was evident at an Iranian embassy news conference here in Washington today, the Iranian government has little power, speaks with many voices, and is afraid to upset the mob.
Both. The government of Iran did not provoke and does not provoke the takeover, but it is unthinkable from a moral standpoint that these young people should be told, go away, you have made a mistake.
The U.S. is also contacting friendly Islamic governments to prevail upon Khomeini, countries like Pakistan, and the response so far is said to have been positive. Meanwhile, there is absolutely no consideration of using force. In the words of one U.S. official, that would simply assure that 60 people would get their throats cut. Barry Dunsmore, ABC News, the State Department.
Some 60 Americans are still being held hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And here in Washington, there is a growing sense of helplessness as well as outrage. The civilian government of Iran, headed by Prime Minister Bazargan, resigned today. And the students, or whoever have seized the embassy there, have threatened to kill the hostages if the U.S. makes any military move to rescue them. So both the White House and the State Department today again ruled out the use of force to save the captive Americans. We have a series of reports tonight. First, with this exclusive account of today in Tehran, here is Bob Dyke.
It is a sight to make any American here in Tehran feel insecure. Hundreds of Iranian demonstrators outside the U.S. Embassy calling for the death of President Carter. One poster showed the president tied to a stake, ready for execution beside the former Shah. To the demonstrators, the student seizure of the embassy and its occupants is the best thing to have happened here since the Islamic Revolution, the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini. The students in control of the grounds held another news conference today. They did not, as they had promised earlier, allow reporters to see any of the Americans held captive in a nearby building. But they did issue a warning to the United States government that any overt attempt to free the hostages would have tragic results.
In case the United States decide to do something like Entebbe airport, as the Israeli did it in Uganda, if they want to do something like this, to release these hostages, you must be sure that they will definitely be killed.
The student spokesman also said that the embassy and its people will be held indefinitely. Their ransom demands that the United States return the exiled Shah to Iran to stand trial. We think, said the spokesman, that the hostages are more important for the United States than the Shah. Here in Tehran tonight, there are reliable reports that student activists have taken 2 more U.S. citizens into custody. They are William Royer and Catherine Cook of the Iran American Society. The report says Monday they were taken from their office to the U.S. Embassy where they were locked up. Bob Dyke, ABC News, Tehran.
This is Ted Koppel at the State Department. Since this crisis began, the U.S. government hasn't had a great deal of leverage in Iran. Now it has even less. The only officials left at the Foreign Ministry in Tehran are second-rank functionaries who themselves don't know how much authority they have. State Department spokesman Halting Carter summed up the dilemma of negotiating with what is almost a phantom government.
We continue to contact whatever officials are available to discuss the matter with them. We are clearly in a changing situation, and which we simply must await now. The accession to power, whatever group represents the Revolutionary Council, whoever it is that's going to run the place.
State Department officials have tried calling the U.S. Embassy in Tehran directly. Whoever answered the phone won't talk to them. So the U.S. government, deeply concerned about the welfare of those 60-odd Americans inside the embassy compound, is reduced to announcing in effect that someone will be held responsible if anything happens to those people.
We have announced what our position is, which is that we expect them to be held without harm and released, and that continues to be the position.
Even that mild warning carries less clout today than it did yesterday, since the question of who is responsible awaits the formation of a new government. No consideration, however, is being given to any military option. President Carter met this morning with his senior advisors, and the central concern remains what it's been since Sunday: doing nothing to jeopardize the lives of those 60 to 65 Americans. Ted Koppel, ABC News at the State Department.
In the present crisis, the resignation of Prime Minister Barzani was inevitable. Since his appointment by Ayatollah Khomeini last February, he's continually been overruled by the Ayatollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Council. Barzani once called Tehran the city of 100 sheriffs. The constant making of policy in the streets led him to say the government's day had been turned into night. Demonstrations such as this will be banned tomorrow by order of Ayatollah Khomeini after reports that a pro-Barzani show of strength was in the making. The Islamic Revolutionary Council is largely a secret body, mostly clerics loyal to Khomeini. One of its most influential members is this man, Mohammad Beheshti. He said today Iran is in need of stability, but like Khomeini, he is determined to rid Iran of any American influence. Ayatollah Khomeini has made it clear the occupation of the embassy is a direct result of the Shah's presence in the United States. In this interview with German television, he also said the United States did not want peace and order restored in Iran, that plans had been found in the embassy which proved, in Khomeini's view, wherever there was unrest in Iran, the United States had a finger. Late today, the Islamic Revolutionary Council asked ministers in Prime Minister Barzani's government to stay on the job. That would help confirm widespread concern in Iran that the clergy is less than capable of running the government's machinery. Frank?
Thank you, Peter. There has also been a flurry of reports tonight that Iran has stopped loading U.S. oil tankers. An administration official tonight said those reports have been received but are not yet confirmed. At the State Department, a special crisis center has been set up to deal with the situation in Iran, but there is also a second area set aside for answering questions from understandably anxious relatives and friends of the American hostages in Tehran. Here's a report from Barry Dunsmore.
In the Situation Room of the State Department today, officials struggled with the problem of how to secure the release of the American hostages in Tehran. But another operation is taking place there, which is also very important: the contacting and reassuring of the families and friends of the hostages. This is a purely volunteer effort by 3 women, one of whose husband is a hostage. She does not want to be identified nor interviewed for fear that anything she might say or do might jeopardize her husband's safety. But she wants to help, and she and her colleagues are making and taking hundreds of calls like this each day.
I'm just calling to tell you that the latest word that we have from Tehran, from a highly placed source in the Iranian Revolutionary Council, is that all of the hostages on the American compound are safe, unharmed, nobody is sick.
Meanwhile, in San Diego, the wife of the U.S. Consul General in Iran is also anxiously awaiting word about her husband. As it happens, yesterday she received a letter from him. It had been written just 2 days after the Shah arrived in New York.
The phrase he used was bracing for trouble. He said they were bracing for trouble because of the Shah going to New York. Obviously, I don't think they expected this much trouble, or they wouldn't have been there.
Barry Dunsmore, ABC News.
Iranian students in this country have often protested against the Shah, and today some did it again. In Philadelphia, about 50 Iranian students under heavy police protection marched on Independence Hall to protest the presence of the Shah in this country. The demonstrators were heckled by passers-by, and in fact 4 of the protesters were arrested but later released. And in Columbus, Ohio, that scene was repeated when about 50 Iranian students demonstrated in front of City Hall demanding the return of the Shah to Iran. Meanwhile, today, the Shah himself remained in his New York City hospital room at Cornell University Medical Center. He was visited by his wife, the Empress Farah, who talked briefly to ABC News correspondent Ann Garrels.
Your Highness, could I talk to you for just a minute? How is your husband?
He's fine, thank you.
Because of what's happened in Iran, would you consider going to another country for treatment?
Excuse me. Well, even though the Empress did not respond, doctors at Cornell seem to be anticipating the Shah will be that patient for some time to come.
The crisis in Iran seems to have taken a turn for the worse tonight. The Ayatollah Khomeini has rejected the latest attempt by the United States to negotiate for the release of some 60 Americans still held hostage in the American embassy compound in Tehran. Last night, the president sent Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General, on a mission to Tehran to negotiate the release of the hostages. But the Ayatollah declared today that neither he nor any other Iranian authority will see Clark, who is now on the ground in Istanbul, Turkey.
If anybody is likely to get a hearing from Ayatollah Khomeini, it is likely to be the PLO chairman Yasser Arafat or his representatives. Shortly after the revolution, Khomeini supporters took over the Israeli embassy in Tehran and awarded its premises to the PLO. Ironically, the Iranian who appeared with Arafat at the time was Ibrahim Yazdi, the present foreign minister who ended the first siege of the American embassy earlier this year. Various reports indicate that the PLO has sent a delegation to try and negotiate the Americans' freedom. The PLO can only regard the opportunity as a golden one. The PLO has been scoring one diplomatic victory after another overseas. The United States continues to ignore it. Were Mr. Arafat to be successful in Tehran, that might prove to be more difficult. Even though Mr. Clark's mission is presently suspended in Istanbul, he was at least a logical person to send to Iran. In January of this year, he went as a private citizen to identify himself with the Iranian Revolution. He marched in the massive demonstration supporting Khomeini, and he subsequently visited the religious leader who was then in exile in France. Tonight, our reporter in Tehran is still Bob Dyke, and here is his report.
The question here in Tehran tonight is how can Ramsey Clark's mission succeed when Iran's supreme ruler has refused to meet with the U.S. delegation? Tonight's news bulletins on the government-run radio and television network say the Ayatollah has banned members of his powerful Revolutionary Council and officials of Iran's provisional government from seeing Clark or anyone acting on President Carter's behalf. If the United States gives back the Shah to Iran, Khomeini is reported to have said, then we can negotiate on a few points. Khomeini did not spell out which points, but it's assumed he was referring to the Americans held hostage behind these gates of the U.S. Embassy. It is nearly 4 days now since the compound was taken over by a group of Iranian youths. There was no sign of any of the hostages today, only their captors and a crowd of anti-American demonstrators outside the embassy grounds. A possible note of moderation was sounded from the student group inside the walls. The activists issued a directive to their allies and sympathizers elsewhere in Iran to stop harassing Americans and other foreigners here. The directive was issued after 3 U.S. citizens were reportedly detained at Tehran airport as they were about to board a flight out of the country. They were later released. And after an unconfirmed report saying 2 more Americans were taken against their will from this Tehran hotel to the U.S. Embassy where they were confined. Bob Dyke, ABC News, Tehran.
Here in this country, the Iranian crisis is directly affecting hundreds of Americans. They are the friends and relatives of the 60 or so hostages being held inside the embassy compound. Well, while we have kept quiet, or many of them have kept quiet out of fear that any comment might endanger those being held, some are beginning to speak out. James Walker has more.
For the families of the some 60 American hostages held in Iran, there is little to do but watch news reports and wait. Among those waiting are the father and son of this 22-year-old Marine sergeant who volunteered for Tehran duty and arrived at the U.S. Embassy last Saturday, the day before it was seized. To protect him from threats, we will not tell you the family's name.
I know that he believes in the Marines. He believes in the country. I mean, I don't know what you call it, whether it's patriotic or, I mean, it sounds like a dirty word anymore, but he was. I mean, he believed in it. And still does. Still does.
This woman comes from the Midwest. Her husband is also a Marine, held prisoner at the embassy. They last talked Friday on their 6th wedding anniversary. She says the United States should not meet Iranian demands to hand over the deposed Shah.
If we did that, then any other little country or branch of radicals could pull the same kind of blackmail garbage on us, and that's all it is garbage.
While she is optimistic about her husband's safety, her mother is worried.
In our government, right now, I just feel that it's very, very, very depressing and very tense. In my own estimation, and I don't know whether the State Department would want me to talk this way or not, in my estimation, the Shah should voluntarily go back to Mexico.
James Walker, ABC News.
Ever since the seizure of the embassy on Sunday, most members of Congress, though privately angry, have tried to refrain from expressing their feelings in order to keep from complicating the situation still further. Today, however, despite the best efforts of the House leadership, several members insisted on speaking their minds. Here's a report from Capitol Hill correspondent Britt Hume.
When he entered the House chamber this afternoon, Speaker Tip O'Neill was hoping there would be no inflammatory speeches about the situation in Iran on the House floor. Indeed, O'Neill had made his the first signature on this letter to the Ayatollah Khomeini requesting his personal intervention to free the captive Americans. The Speaker urged all members to sign the letter, but his hopes for restraint were dashed almost the moment the session began.
Mr. Speaker, it is decision time. It is time to give the Khomeinis of this world the message that the U.S. is through backing away and apologizing. It is time to let the world know that our present policy of appeasement is firmly terminated.
I have suggested to the White House that the United States immediately incarcerate the representatives of the Iranian government serving at their nation's embassy here in Washington and anywhere else in the United States, and that these Iranians not be released until all Americans in Iran are returned safely to the United States or to their duties in Iran.
I am sincerely hopeful that this tragedy in Iran today is the spark which will indeed arouse Americans, and that we will demand a change in the dovish, inactive, placid, and potentially disastrous foreign policy which we are following today.
The Ayatollah Khomeini probably doesn't know who Tip O'Neill is, and he seems unlikely to respond to the signatures and speeches of a group of American congressmen. But the reaction here does add to the political pressure on President Carter somehow to resolve this crisis. Britt Hume, ABC News, on Capitol Hill.
Senator Edward M. Kennedy of Massachusetts announced today he is running for president. The setting was different, but the sound was not. And though the words today were about the present and the future, the past was not, could not be forgotten. January 2nd, 1960, Washington, D.C.
I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. The presidency is the most powerful office in the free world. Through its leadership can come a more vital life for all of our people.
March 16th, 1968. Same city, same room.
I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course, and because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel that I'm obliged to do all that I can.
Today, November 7th, 1979, Boston.
This country is not prepared to sound retreat. It is ready to advance. It is willing to make a stand. and so am I. Today, I formally announce that I'm a candidate for President of the United States.
Look at this. One American, blindfolded, handcuffed. Today, in the courtyard of the American Embassy in Tehran, he and 60-some others still held hostage and threatened in a country gone out of control. The pictures exclusive, as are so many more in this broadcast.
This is an ABC News special. The Iran crisis. America held hostage. From Washington, correspondent Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. It's Friday morning there now, but throughout this night in Washington, officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom. That search was not successful today. In this broadcast, we'll have reports on the diplomatic efforts to resolve the problem and on other aspects of the crisis as well. But we begin now with an on-the-scene account by the one American television correspondent who has been there since the beginning, the seizure of the embassy last Sunday, and who, with his crew, has provided us with outstanding coverage all this week. Here is Bob Dyke in Tehran.
This picture tells it all. This flag was apparently taken from someone's office inside the United States Embassy. It was burned Tuesday evening outside the embassy's gates. To the Iranian demonstrators who set fire to it, this was a symbol of victory. He was turned to face reporters and cameramen and several hundred Iranian demonstrators outside the embassy's gates. "Yankee, go home," they cried, but they made no attempt to harm him. Eventually, he was led back to join the other captives who have been kept out of sight.
But this young woman was released a few hours after the embassy was seized Sunday. She worked there as a low-level interpreter. She is an Iranian who spent time studying in the United States, and her name is Imam, and she recalls how the embassy fell.
You were at the embassy when it was taken over on Sunday.
Yes, I was.
What happened?
About 10:15, a group of demonstrators came in front of the building, in front of the embassy compound, and they walked in.
They walked in?
They actually
Did
walked
anyone try to stop them?
No, I don't believe so.
Because?
They said that they just wanted to stage a sit-in, and
What
they didn't
happened
want to
next?
harm anyone. They came in front of the chancellery. We saw them through the window. They had a banner saying, "We don't want to harm anyone, we just want to stage a sit-in."
How did the people at the embassy react to that, the guards?
We were taken on the second floor, maximum security floor, and we were given tear gas masks, and we were told to stay calm.
What happened after that?
A couple of hours went by and we heard a siren. When I asked one of the Marines what had happened, they said that they had stormed the building.
They, meaning the students?
The students, yes. They
What
came
happened?
inside the
What
building.
happened after that?
Well, they came behind the door where we were held, and they said, if you all get out, and if you don't resist, we will not harm anyone, and we just want to stage a sit-in, and we just want to ask a couple of questions. So they came in, the Marines opened the door, and they came in, and they took all of us, blindfolded us, tied our hands behind our backs, and they took us.
Did any of you try to resist?
No, none of us.
Were any shots fired during the takeover?
No, just tear gas canisters.
Were any of the students armed?
No, none of them were armed. A couple of them had sticks.
Were there any fights?
No scuffles, no fights.
No scuffles between the U.S. Embassy personnel?
No, everything was calm.
It was another small victory for the activists who are fully backed by their country's supreme ruler, the Ayatollah Khomeini. It seems the Iranian students have the initiative. The next move is evidently up to the United States. The United States government was not only in deep sympathy with the deposed ruler and his family, but plotting to restore. America's investment here was considerable before the Shah's downfall,
billions of dollars spent, much of it for defense. Iran's Army and Air Force, equipped with the latest sophisticated military hardware, including Phoenix missiles and F-14s, was considered vital to Western security. Iran is bordered in the north by the Soviet Union, and American monitoring stations were deployed along the frontier. Despite the embassy takeover, with relations between the two countries never worse than now, Iran's oil pipelines to the U.S. are still open. For how long is for the Ayatollah to say. His followers today at the U.S. Embassy held another news conference, this time to release copies of what the Iranian activists claim are secret United States government documents. If they are genuine, and they look genuine, it would seem that the State Department was deeply worried that Iranians might misinterpret the Shah's admittance to the United States as a move towards restoring him to the peacock throne. This communique, dated last August, says every attempt should be made by embassy officials here in Tehran to convince Iranians that the State Department was resisting efforts to allow the Shah into America, and says we should make no move towards admitting the Shah until we have obtained and tested a new and substantially more effective guard force for the embassy. Bob Dyke, ABC News, Tehran.
Thank you, Bob. We'll be back to you later in this broadcast. The United States is in this fix because the former Shah of Iran is suffering from cancer and is receiving needed treatment in this country. But that explanation, that justification for his presence here is not accepted by the Iranians, who have always suspected the United States was the Shah's ultimate destination. Here's a report from Barry Dunsmore.
February. The Iranian mobs have driven the Shah out, and the question of where he goes becomes an important factor in U.S. policy toward Iran. Initially, it's assumed he will come to the U.S. President Carter even says so publicly. However, it soon becomes evident that the Shah will be an unwanted guest. March, and the Shah is in Morocco. The administration is looking for an emissary to ask the Shah not to come to the U.S. because of the delicate state of relations between Washington and the new regime in Tehran. David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger are approached. Both angrily refuse, and instead, Kissinger begins a strong campaign to get the Shah into this country. April, Kissinger meets privately with Secretary Vance and also talks to the president. In each case, his message is, a man who for 37 years was a friend of the United States should not be treated like a Flying Dutchman who cannot find a port of call. At this point, Kissinger turns south. He is in direct contact with Mexican President Lopez Portillo. Without too much persuasion, the Mexicans agree to give the Shah a visa. July, Richard Nixon joins the campaign to admit the Shah. He visits him in Mexico and makes the point that this is no way to treat our friends. September, and the administration is still holding firm. Vance makes the point stronger than he's ever made it. Admitting the Shah may seem right, but I do not think it would be in our national interest to do so. He adds, we have had to take into account the possible dangers to American people. He clearly has the embassy compound in mind. Early October, the Shah is ill, and Rockefeller is contacted. He recommends a New York specialist, Dr. Benjamin Keene. Keene goes to Mexico. He finds the Shah very ill and learns of his long bout with a form of cancer. Keene recommends to the State Department that the Shah be brought to New York for treatment, but the department is skeptical. Keene is labeled a Kissinger-Rockefeller doctor. This infuriates Rockefeller, who gets on the phone to protest this absurdity. Finally, State Department doctors review Keene's examination and agree the Shah is very ill. Late October, top officials contemplate the next step. The State Department's number 3, David Newsom, who was the top man on Iran, argues that admitting the Shah, even under these circumstances, could be dangerous. However, the president decides the Shah should be let in. October 22nd, the Shah is admitted to New York Hospital, but not before the government of Iran is told that the decision to admit him is purely humanitarian and not political. The U.S. agrees to send the Ayatollah medical reports, but not to let his doctors examine the Shah. Now, with more than 60 lives at stake, there is a residue of bitterness. There are those who are bitter toward the Shah, and there are sources close to the Shah who say that since the embassy was seized, Washington has once again been trying to get him to submit to an examination by doctors from Tehran. One source claims it was even proposed he be operated on again, just to prove he was ill. The State Department denies both these charges. The decision to allow the Shah in apparently was a calculated risk. It didn't work because the state of anarchy in Iran is such that it's not possible to deal with that country in any logical or rational way. Frank?
Thank you, Barry. So that's how this country finds itself in the present crisis. But we are now in a world in which terrorism has become almost the norm of international politics. Here's John Martin to put that in perspective.
In 1948, Jewish commandos blew up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killing 91 people. The goal? Terrorize the British government into leaving Palestine to the Jews. 30 years later, South Moluccans living in Holland commandeered trains and took over a school and held passengers and students hostage for days and weeks. The goal? Terrorize the Dutch government into pressuring the Indonesian government for a homeland for the Moluccans. The Israelis succeeded. The South Moluccans have not. And in those 3 decades, the world has grown wary and fearful of terrorism. Now it is wondering if the Iranian student takeover represents a new form of terrorism. For the first time, it appears a sovereign power is permitting its people to play with the lives of hostages. Most other terrorist maneuvers have come from small groups acting without government approval. The Red Brigades in Italy, shooting and kidnapping and murdering for a cause. The Japanese Red Army faction hijacking an airplane and trying to terrorize its government into action. The Palestine Liberation Organization sending terrorists into a kind of combat with the approval of a government in exile. The PLO regards itself as one, but with no status, no embassies, no sovereignty that would admit it to nationhood. In Iran, in the wake of the Shah's overthrow and this week's takeover, there is no civilian government, but there is civilian authority held by the Ayatollah Khomeini and other religious leaders. They are the government, not in name, but in fact. So, is this the first time a government has resorted to terrorism or condoned it? The answer is no. The Philippine government has permitted prison guards to torture and terrorize political opponents held without charge. The Chilean government, under General Pinochet, has permitted thousands of its citizens to disappear in a reign of terror by government agents. The Soviet government terrorizing millions of its citizens with a secret police and slave labor camps. And in Iran itself, the most powerful example in the so-called free world, the infamous Sabak, the Shah's secret police, tortured and terrorized anybody who might threaten the Shah's autocratic rule. Once, before he was driven out, the Shah was asked by ABC correspondent Barbara Walters whether, in view of his power, he would be willing to permit any criticism of his regime.
No.
Why not?
Because the person of the king is, it's even in French you have lèse-majesté. You have a law in the world. You cannot insult the king.
Anyone who did, in the early as well as the final days of the Shah's regime, faced torture and prison. So the nature of terrorism hasn't changed much in 30 years. It is still an unreasoning route to power and control, sometimes bloody. And in Iran, it has turned full circle now, no longer from the Shah, but from the people who used to call him a terrorist. Frank?
It was disclosed today that the United States has halted the shipment to Iran of any military equipment or spare parts so long as the hostages are held in the embassy. Now, this is one way in which the United States is carefully but firmly trying to get a message through to Iran. Here's a report from diplomatic correspondent Ted Koppel.
It's a message that has yet to be formally transmitted to the Ayatollah Khomeini. It's in a letter that President Carter wrote and gave to Ramsey Clark. Clark, though, is still sitting in Istanbul waiting for permission to get into Iran. The letter he's carrying calls on Iranian authorities to obtain the release of those American hostages. But ABC News has learned it also requests that all Americans be allowed to leave Iran. That would mean no American diplomats left in that country. And it's understood from reliable sources that the Carter administration does not intend to maintain normal diplomatic relations with Iran unless and until a government there is formed that will abide by the most fundamental precepts of international relations. At the top of that list, the universally accepted rule that a host government must be responsible for the safety of foreign diplomats on its territory. But no such action can be taken while the Americans are still hostage. This is the 5th agonizing day for the U.S. government, a frustrating 5 days for the American public. And a lot of people think that perhaps they have solutions to the crisis that Washington hasn't considered.
If you were President Carter, what would your decision be concerning Iran and the presence of hostages, American citizens, in that country?
The choice is war now or gradually giving the world to the Russians and the communist-backed revolutionaries, quote unquote, and the students, quote unquote. Then I think, it's time to land 30,000 Marines on the shore of Iran and go in and take over the American property, which the U.S. Embassy is.
Well, why not? Plain and simply, the president's advisors feel that military intervention would be the surest way of getting the hostages killed. There's no way of getting to the embassy quickly. It's in the heart of Tehran, many miles from the nearest airport. There isn't even a nearby location where paratroopers could be dropped in. And it's too far from either the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf to send helicopters, unless you have an available airfield nearby to refuel them for the flight out again. Of course, if something happens to the hostages, all bets are off. And you can assume that the military has already worked up a series of options. But again, that's only once the safety of the hostages is no longer a consideration.
The only one who can pull it off is Yasser Arafat. And though he might be an enemy of Israel, I wouldn't care if he was Pancho Villa. If he can get those 60 people out of there, let him go ahead and do it. Let him make a grandstand. It doesn't bother me. I have no private axe to grind.
In this case, the Carter administration is in total agreement. In fact, State Department spokesman Halting Carter said as much today.
As was observed earlier, we are not really sure exactly what the PLO has in mind. But if they are moving to help release the Americans held in the embassy, it would be a highly responsible action in a situation where they may have some influence. As I said yesterday, we welcome such assistance.
The only problem, there is still some question as to whether the PLO will be accepted by the Iranians as a mediator. Iran Radio today rejected their offer.
If I was President Carter, I don't think it'd be any problem making a decision at all, because the first thing I would do would be to deport all of these Iranian students or any other foreign students that are over here who demonstrate against this government.
It has jarred a lot of people seeing Iranians who may or may not be legitimate students free to demonstrate while Americans are held hostage in Iran.
Why doesn't the United States simply retaliate by arresting all of you and holding you hostage?
First of all, the United States is a civilized nation. You classify yourself as very educated people, and being an educated people, I very much doubt you would do such a thing.
It's not quite that cut and dry. A lot of Iranians are in this country now under less than legitimate circumstances, and Washington is considering the deportation of those people. But not now. Again, the concern is for the hostages. The main objective, to do nothing that might lead to reprisals against the men and women being held in Iran. And also, while it might make some people feel good to kick those Iranian demonstrators out of the country, it wouldn't do a thing toward gaining the release of the hostages.
I, for one, would be willing to pay $4 a gallon of gas if we got the oil in the spot market and instead of from Iran.
Well, you won't hear any argument from the administration. But if that represents a majority view, it's not being communicated to Congress or the White House or in public opinion polls. If Americans were willing to pay the world spot market price, gas lines would be a thing of the past, with or without Iranian oil. It might not be $4 a gallon, but pretty close to $3, and a lot more conservation and a real energy program. But oil isn't the immediate problem. Those hostages are. And every option that the U.S. government is reviewing these days puts that consideration at the top of the list. Frank?
Thank you, Ted. An ABC News poll conducted today reveals that Americans, while outraged over what has happened in Iran, are generally keeping their cool. 37% of those polled believe the government should rely on diplomacy to free the hostages. Only 11% favor an American invasion of Iran, and 17% are in favor of threatening to use force to free the hostages. Only 12% believe the Shah should be turned over to the Iranians, and 13% think he should go, if not back to Iran, then to some other country than this one. Well, public opinion is a factor, but in the end, decisions cannot be made on the basis of polls. The ultimate responsibility rests with one man. Here's a report from White House correspondent Sam Donaldson.
Monday morning, the president returns from Camp David, and on his way into the White House, a reporter asks him, "What about Iran?" "Sy will have a statement later," is the reply, meaning Secretary of State Vance will be the front man on this one. Mr. Carter meets with his top advisors, but those deliberations are not made public here. Tuesday, the president appoints a new campaign manager, the incomparable Robert Strauss. The small talk has nothing to do with Iran. But Strauss, on Capitol Hill, hits back hard at the growing sense that the president isn't meeting the crisis forcefully enough.
People are calling me from all over who are not thinking and say, the president ought to move in there and bang away and do this, that, and the other and show his macho and he'll go up 20 points in the polls. Well, the truth of the matter is he'd also destroy somewhere between 58 and 500 lives of American people. So that's a luxury that he can't afford himself.
Wednesday, Mr. Carter sees his wife off for Thailand, then stops to chat with aides. What's new in Iran, a reporter calls. We'll have an announcement later this morning. Secretary Vance will, he says. Will the Clark mission succeed, he's asked. I hope it will. I'm praying for it, is the answer. Later in the White House driveways, Big Neff Brzezinski is purposely vague about the Clark mission.
We hope that this situation can be resolved in a manner that's consistent with international principles. All the nations of the world have a stake in these principles being upheld, and we are confident that the ultimate resolution of this problem will be on that basis.
Thursday, today, Prime Minister Lynch of Ireland arrives on a state visit. The president denounces terrorism in general.
Those who advocate violence and terrorism violate the laws of God and the laws of man.
Later, Press Secretary Jody Powell announces Mr. Carter will not go on his own state visit to Canada tomorrow and restates the overall crisis policy of restraint.
I think we have made it clear that we are pursuing a policy of quiet and firm diplomacy and that military action is not being considered.
How long can this go on, however?
I don't think it's appropriate to be setting deadlines.
And at tonight's state dinner for Irish Prime Minister Lynch, Mr. Carter touches on the subject, but only in a glancing way.
A little earlier this evening, I had to cancel my long-planned trip to Canada because Americans are suffering from international terrorism and being held against their will. And my responsibility is to protect the lives of Americans in foreign countries and here at home.
As you have seen, the president has personally avoided discussing this crisis in public. Presidents do avoid discussing bad news when they can. But it would be unfair to say that that was the main reason for the president's silence. It is felt here that any discussion by Mr. Carter of a situation so tense might only add to the difficulty of convincing the Ayatollah and his students that reason and sanity should prevail. There'll be plenty of time to either applaud or condemn the outcome when it's over. But for now, Mr. Carter feels that the best way he can earn his pay is to do it in private.
The rest of the world has not been completely silent about the plight of the American hostages. In the Muslim world, Turkey, Pakistan, and according to some reports, Algeria are trying to help. But what about our allies in Western Europe? Peter Jennings has a report. Peter?
There is no question that America's allies would like to help, and many are trying. The trouble is, like the United States, most of them have either poor or tenuous relations with Ayatollah Khomeini. Germany's an example. The Germans offered to help, but are handicapped by the fact that the Shah has business interests in Germany, and the German government is nervous about the safety of its own nationals.
I wholly agree with my honourable friend that activity in taking over the United States Embassy was an outrage to diplomatic relations everywhere. We're naturally very pleased that our embassy was only subject to it for a short time. We will do anything we can to help the United States achieve justice.
Admirable sentiments from the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But the British Embassy has been under siege as well, albeit briefly, and the British Foreign Office has the same problem as the State Department. Exactly with whom do you deal? One European government does feel it has a productive line of communication with the embassy's occupiers. but it insists the negotiations it's pursuing are so delicate the government doesn't wish to be identified. The Vatican is reportedly frustrated at its inability to help, and even the French government, which gave Ayatollah Khomeini exile before the revolution, is in an awkward position because the former Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar is in France, and Iran wants him back too. It is important to note that while Ayatollah Khomeini has more influence than any other individual in Iran, while he has expressed his support for the embassy occupiers, events in the past have sometimes shown he's not in control of everyone all the time. Frank?
We have heard already that Iranian oil is important to us, certainly not as important as American lives, but still a matter for concern. We have two reports tonight on the oil factor. First, Bill Zimmerman.
There are only sporadic and sometimes conflicting reports from Iran regarding the oil situation. There have been some apparently minor interruptions. And while the country's present oil minister says shipments to the West have not been cut, he emphasizes they can and will be if the Ayatollah Khomeini gives the word. With that in mind, executives from 10 major oil companies came to a meeting today with Energy Secretary Charles Duncan and other government officials. They discussed, among other things, what to do if there's a major interruption in the Iranian oil flow to the United States.
We have no confirmed reports at this time that there have been any such interruptions. But in view of the very tight balance between supply and demand throughout the world, we feel it prudent to have contingency planning.
If Iran should decide to use its oil weapon, it has three basic options. It could stop production entirely, take its 3 million barrels a day off the world market. That would seem an unlikely choice, since the oil revenue supports Iran's economy. A second option, continue its present production level while embargoing shipments to the United States. That would seem an ineffective choice. The U.S. could simply buy the oil from a third party. Or Iran could combine an embargo on American shipments with a production cut of 700,000 barrels a day, the amount the U.S. now buys there. That eventually would hurt. Those 700,000 barrels a day represent 4% of the oil this country uses. It would take some time for the physical effects to be felt here. The pipeline is several weeks long. But the psychological effect would be immediate, sending shivers through an already jittery international spot market, as Greg Dobbs reports.
If Iranian oil stops flowing to the U.S., it will quite possibly be sold here at the port of Rotterdam, Holland. And for Iran, why not? Rotterdam is, after all, the world's biggest oil auction, the so-called spot market. The biggest buyers are those who most need and can most afford it, West Germany and Japan. Just this week, through dealers here, Iranian oil has been priced at about $47 a barrel, twice the world price, twice what Iran's been getting from the United States. There is, though, the chance that additional Iranian oil won't be coming here. According to a top oil analyst, Iran may already be making as much money as it now needs.
It may make sense for them just to leave it in the ground. After all, the price is going to go up in the long term, and probably the best investment, assuming you can make ends meet. It makes a lot of sense to leave it in the ground. And this, I think, is one of the biggest fears that the consuming West has.
For the consuming West, Rotterdam is the place to watch. It's become a pace setter for world oil prices, and so any Iranian action against the United States must send those prices up.
Well, despite the government's determination to deal with the Iranian situation cautiously and calmly, it's clear that many Americans are angry, and some of them have taken that anger into the streets. Here's Ann Garrels.
In Houston, people have taken to the streets, protesting against Khomeini and his Iranian supporters who work and study in the area. Over 1,500 demonstrators marched on the Iranian consulate in downtown Houston, telling Iranians to go home. They burned Iranian flags and signed petitions. One Iranian couple who declared their support for the Ayatollah barely escaped the crowd's outrage. Firemen at Engine Company 58 in New York City are frustrated by the current stalemate, and some say they would go to Iran if it would help.
If it means going over there, we'll go over there, whatever we can do. So something's got to be done.
If it has to be done, it has to be done, and that's it. I mean, you have to do something. I mean, you just can't be getting pushed around.
At New York's Kennedy Airport, transport workers announced today that they won't service Iranian aircraft until the American hostages are freed. As a result, one plane has already been rerouted to Montreal.
We only hope that what we're doing here today will start, and we're sure of this, will start a chain of protests throughout the United States by all American labor unions.
Longshoremen in New Jersey agree. They've refused to unload cargo from Iranian ships, but some want even more action.
I'd like to see us go right in there and get our hostages. If it means a quarter more a gallon for gasoline, I'm willing to pay, and I think all the rest of the people are.
When I watch TV, the news, and I see what they do to that flag, it gets me in the heart.
Anxiety grows, naturally, with every passing hour. On the other hand, so does hope. And we close tonight with this reminder of responsibility given us today by Kenneth Blakely, the president of the American Foreign Service Association. Blakely appealed to all Americans to be prudent in their actions and public remarks because, quote, of the precarious condition in which our colleagues find themselves, end quote. Prudence, patience, words that may not stir the blood, but may keep it from being spilled. This is Frank Reynolds for ABC News. Good night from Washington.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.